honored ministers and distinguished guests. It's my great privilege to be with you this morning. I'm excited about the opportunity to have a conversation, but I really think it's a great honor to have an opportunity to kick off what should be an important week, an important time in the state of education. As John mentioned, in my role, I have a real great privilege to travel around the world and have done so for many, many years, visiting thousands of schools in countries all over the world, looking at the state of education and the transformation. It's clear the opportunity is at hand, and now is a great time and a great opportunity in no better place to have this conversation than in Africa. But I also see the need for us to think differently and bring change about in the classroom. When I come into schools and I travel around the world, I recognize the need for us to accelerate change. We can't lose a generation of kids while we debate and discuss. We have to support and celebrate the amazing commitment from leaders like yourself. And one of the great honors that I have in my role is to thank and recognize that commitment every day. And certainly I appreciate the hard work that you're doing on behalf of your students and educators. We also recognize that we need to power leaders with training and tools to embrace this transformation holistically, to celebrate educators in a positive way, to uplift their innovation, and then lastly, to support students to drive change. For me, I frame this out in three phrases: expect more, do more, be more. And to start, we've got to raise our expectations of what's possible, the kind of depth of change that we need to bring into our classrooms and our schools, empowering students to expect more every day they walk into your schools, expect more from their own future, recognize a limitless potential within their own lives and their own communities, and drive the change that you need to make to sustain the economic growth and potential in your countries. We need to certainly do more to enable that change, and really fundamentally connected to the notion of helping students be more. And that root in economic development and potential is critical as we think about this landscape. We know in Africa, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies exist. The potential for economic transformation in education is clear, and one of the things that I'm most enthused by as I talk to education ministers from around the world is there's a depth of recognition that economic prosperity, and a sustained one, is rooted in a foundation in education in a country. Now, this growth that we see in Africa and the potential for significant growth across the global continent and the economy is going to be fueled by education. We see challenges, though, as sub-Saharan Africa represents the lowest enrollment across education in primary, secondary, and tertiary on the planet. Now, this represents not only a reality for us to recognize, but an opportunity for us to embrace the power. With the economic growth and potential we're currently experiencing, powered by an education platform to sustain that growth, we can do amazing things. Now, this reality with regards to education rates is reflected in an unemployment that is certainly stronger across youth than the adult population in many countries in Africa. And this is a growing reality that's reflected in a shortage of jobs that's increasing. We're adding about 12 million youth to the workforce every year across Africa. And from 2000 to 2005 to 2007, you see a growth of 96 million working population across Africa and a job growth of only 63 million. So as we're adding more population to the workforce, how do we create a catalyst for jobs? Now, this is not only an important thing for us in Africa to embrace, it's a global reality that we have to recognize. By 2035, Africa will lead China in terms of working population, and the workforce of youth will be 41% of the overall population across Africa. Now, this is a huge reality that we have to prepare for and recognize. This is a catalyst for amazing change that can propel economies across the continent in new ways, but it's a recognition that we've got to work faster and smarter to make the change possible in education. Now, when we think about education, we think about youth in our schools. We've got to recognize the connection to skills and preparedness to prepare them for the workforce challenges and needs. And when we look at this girl in this slide, the question we must need to ask is not only are we preparing her to get a job? Do we have the skills that she needs to work in the current environment with the workforce realities that exist, but is she going to be a catalyst to create jobs? Because in order to meet the workforce gaps, we've got to have students who are powered with entrepreneurship, with leadership, with hunger and creativity and curiosity and expectations to drive the workforce change. And if we can create that catalyst today in the classroom, we'll be planting the seeds for sustained economic growth to make not only the prosperity of your countries great, but the potential for us to change the lives of the students in your classroom real. Now, when we look at the realities of this shift, the workforce of today is requiring different skills of our classroom. And one of the things that I think we often recognize but overlook as it relates to the world of learning and the classrooms that we're preparing for is the dynamics of the workforce has shifted, the dynamics of learning has shifted, how all of us create, collaborate, communicate, share information and ideas has been changed with the rise of technology, the growth of the internet, the availability of content ubiquitously. The way in which we all learn is fundamentally changed. The way in which the workforce has changed has also reflected that reality, where curiosity and collaboration, creativity, critical thinking becomes core to not only thriving in the workforce, but fueling the economies that are growing fastest. Now, this reality is actually creating new opportunities for embracing innovative teaching methodologies in schools. And in many ways, the innovation that we need to drive in our learning environments has to be in reflection of the reality of that workforce shift. As students are looking to not only shift jobs from career to career, creating a much more lifelong set of skills that will propel them throughout the workplace. Now, this is an important shift as we recognize how we prepare teachers and school leaders to bring those creative environments into the learning environments that we reflect in our schools. And in many cases, the tension that we often feel, and sometimes that tension is with access to information, access to a quality teacher. Sometimes it's access to technology. But the other tension we often feel is a disconnect between the current modality and environment of classrooms today and the reality that we need to foster to drive connection to the workforce that's growing, the workforce that's needed to fuel economies in your countries. Now, the reality is we've got to think about this across the reality of children today in schools, the reality that students are outside of schools and are learning everywhere, and certainly many students in your countries have the opportunity to learn in and out of school throughout their environments, and then certainly the adult population. We've got to think about all of this collectively. And in many ways, the work that you need to do as education leaders has to be inclusive of that change. And this is where we can think about modern learning environments, the promise of technology to be a catalyst to enable that change, but to think about this holistically. Now, there are four key things that we have to recognize. Certainly, we need to modernize, reform, and certainly rethink our overall schooling environments. This is the physical spaces. How do we make them safer, more efficient, more effective for learning? And how do we rethink the way in which the student is motivated to actually enter the classroom ready to learn and prepared to grow? How do we think about making education more relevant to the community? And that relevance is critical. One of the things that I can tell you, when students start to go later in their education career, content becomes the focus. As you get from core basic skills, from reading and math, learning how to play, learning how to write in the early grades, content starts to become more and more critical for the learning process. This has been historically in terms of what we've done in sort of content assessment paradigm. And what happens typically in those environments is that relevance becomes an area that you have to recognize. Making that content relevant to not only developing skills, but relevant to the communities, to the aspirations, to the dreams of the students we're serving is really, really critical. Now, certainly we understand the opportunity to align technology to drive and be a catalyst for that, but it has to be done in the right place. And then all of this cemented to create the workforce that we need to drive innovation going forward. Now, those are the four pillars that I think we need to focus on. Now, a lot of this is fueled because of the dynamic of technology. And we know technology has a role, it's driving some of these changes. But one of the things I must stress, and this should mean a lot coming from someone who works in a technology company, that technology is not the plan. It shouldn't be the plan for your constituents either. If you tell your teachers your vision is to buy computers for students, the teachers will often have resistance to that because they're struggling with their own realities in the classrooms and they don't understand why the focus is on technology. The plan has got to be about how to transform learning to empower your country and your system for growth and impact. We know technology will and should be part of the plan, but it shouldn't be the plan itself. And this is critical to understand because your legacy as ministers, as leaders, will be driven long beyond a device, a piece of technology. It'll be around changing the foundation for learning in your country and your schools. Now, this is reflected in many of you, and this will be probably talked about quite a bit, is the OECD recent report, which basically is a wake-up call, but in many cases an affirmation of things that I've seen and recognized for many, many years, that people matter. Technology is great, but people are better, and people are going to drive this change. Empowering a student to expect that they can achieve anything. Empowering a teacher to drive innovation, accept failure as part of the learning journey. And then enabling teachers and school leaders to drive that change holistically. That's the core element. Now, technology can be a tool, it can be a powerful tool, but it has to be used correctly. And we can do that with thoughtfulness, we can do that with purposefulness in the classroom, and we can do that with your leadership to drive the change. And we must be connected and committed to that change, to enable every student to achieve more. And in many ways, as you'll see, many companies throughout, many discussions that we'll have in the next few days, our unifying goal needs to be about helping students achieve more. That we'll overcome obstacles, we'll think through new ideas, we'll embrace failure in many cases, but we'll also learn from that failure to drive the kind of change. And one of the things that I will share with you is I'm encouraged by the opportunity for many of you and your education systems, both with your own leadership that I've experienced and directly connected to. And I just came from a couple of days in South Africa where I saw the potential and the energy for change in that country. The opportunity for many of you to leapfrog other countries around the planet. Many countries that have more resources, that have had things like technology in their classrooms longer. With thoughtfulness, with the right thinking and the right leadership, you can make amazing change happen and leapfrog, frankly, the change that's even happening in my own country with regards to education technology. Now, one of the realities of my travels is I often see the changes happening because of one person. When I go into a great school, I can diagnose that great school because there's a great leader in the school. Often when I go to schools around the world, I get led into classrooms where I see an amazing teacher. And that teacher is making magical things happen for their student. But often, sadly, right down the hall, next door, in the classroom just right across the hall, there's less amazing things happening. There's no magic happening because every teacher, every leader is struggling to make this happen because of their own energy, their own commitment, their own passion. And while we've all leveraged that and harnessed that to drive change, the true change is going to be about actually setting the foundation with leadership. Do we have the right environment to scale innovation? Are your teachers who are doing wonderful things, do they expect that they should share their ideas with others and learn from the ideas of others inside their schools and across their country? Have we created a community where we can support and celebrate each other? These are the foundational changes that you will need to put in place to drive this outcome. Now, one of the realities is, and certainly as a reflection of technology and the stuff that we bring into schools, is I know that the reality of change that will happen in your classrooms comes from within. It looks at what is the motivation and environments that you're creating in your classrooms and your schools. What is the expectations from your community about your students? What's the learning environment look like? And then fundamentally, how are we changing curriculum, content, expectations, assessment to reflect those needs? When we make those changes from within, leveraging the power of your people to drive that change, technology and other tools can be brought in actively and aggressively to do that. But when you hand a device, a laptop to a teacher, she'll ask, how do I use it? What do I do with it? How do I take the lessons and learning I've done for years and use that with a computer? And the journey starts to shift to be about remediating the technology acquisition versus truly transforming the opportunities for children. And in many cases, in even the best examples I see around the world, the best we hope for is actually not just acquiring technology, is automating with technology. We've got to actually transform. And this, frankly, transforms by thinking about what technology can enable in the first place. Now, the one thing that I think we often look at is technology in the classroom. But the fundamental thing that I recognize is that technology has a role to inform learning outside of the classrooms. And I know access and bandwidth is a challenge, but the reality is technology has an opportunity and potential to change the core learning paradigm. A learning paradigm that was built around scarcity of educators, scarcity of content, and time to learn was critical. And in that environment, the assessment of a student was the variable. Some students would fail and succeed, and time would march on. And students who were struggling would struggle further and walk out of school and drop out. And the students who were achieving may get bored because the educator was having to keep the student on pace. Technology, because of its role in enabling communication and connection outside of the classroom, learning and content across devices, across the internet, outside of school, enables us to shift the core learning paradigm to enable time from being a fixed asset of the learning environment of the past to being a variable in the learning environments of today, where mastery becomes the core, where every student gets an A, and they get an A at different times, they get an A at different places, but they progress based on their own connection to content, their development of skills, and a mastery of the work that they're doing in their progression. Technology enables educators to enable that change, to embrace that change, and to drive that thoughtfully across subjects and disciplines. Now, when we think about this transformation, I often will say, what is your mountaintop? This is a question I ask all of you to reflect on. What are you trying to achieve? What is your mission? And have we actually started from there, and is that clear to your constituents? One of the best rules of thumb I will tell you is, as education leaders, is if your constituents, your voters, your parents, your teachers, recognize your agenda for leadership and change in things that are happening this year or tomorrow, the risk and the opportunity for a failure of that vision is higher. When you root your vision, your philosophy, in a mission to change learning, to transform the environments of your schools, and to power every student to reach their potential, the opportunity for you to drive that change sustainably for many, many years is at hand. And all of the activities, whether it's buying technology or laptops or smart boards, becomes incremental to that vision, service to that vision. And in many ways, when we start and keep that aspiration high, the journey can be broad, it can be varied, and sometimes as we walk up the mountain, just like in normal mountain climbing, you may have to come down a little bit to acclimate, and that reflects the learnings that we've had in this environment. And this is critical as we think about creating a foundation for true transformation. And we've got to think about that framework as it relates to leadership, as it relates to 21st century learning pedagogy, how we think about how we bring skills into the classroom deeply, to enable students to have the motivation and relevance to not only pursue their path, but to actually have skills that meet the needs of the workforce going forward. The workforce, in many cases, that is being invented by them and certainly will be continuing inventing while they're in school today. So as we shift that environment, I think it's critical. Now, I know technology can be an answer, but technology powered by great teachers and great leaders has got to be the goal, not technology first. And I think that's a core element that we've got to think about, and putting this transformation in place is critical. Starting about where you're going, thinking about what you have, what learnings do you have in your countries, and there are points of light in all of your classrooms, amazing best practices that we can leverage and share from other examples. There are examples that we've learned from failure in all of the countries around the world. We need to leverage that, be strengthened by that, be emboldened by that to drive the change that's needed. We then need to listen to each other, listen to the voice of students, listen to the lessons from other leaders around the world, and then innovate from that foundation. And then when we have that innovation that's been fueled by the right critical questioning, by the right investigation and the right inclusion across the schools, we can drive the kind of change that we need in our classrooms. But we have to start from that foundation, and this framework actually provides a methodology for us to think about this transformation going forward. Now, the potential is real, and it should be something that we should be excited by. I know the challenges are real. Sometimes teachers are feeling just depressed by the stress of the change. They may be resistant to technology as an enemy because they fear being displaced and devalued because of technology. What we must do is start with the foundation that celebrates educators. One of the things that I get a chance to do in a blog that I do called Daily Adventures is celebrate these amazing heroes in our societies every day. And I know the potential for teachers to drive the transformation is critical. Technology without amazing teachers is not going to drive the change that we need. And we have to see that change broadly and be emboldened by it. Now, there are many examples that we can get inspired by. Certainly, this example from Korea, this is a picture from Seoul from 1965 and one today. The potential for education to create a foundation to change our communities, to change the foundation of our economies is real. It's something that will drive the opportunities and discussions throughout this week, but certainly going forward. And we see these examples. We see this from the lesson of Jamaica and Singapore. And these are countries in 1965, again, had a GDP that was similar. Actually, Jamaica had a larger GDP than Singapore in 1965. At that time, in the time of independence, Singapore decided to focus on really two elements for the change. One was creating a foundation for education and education development, and another was to enable entrepreneurship to be core to the fabric of the environment across the country. And you can see the impact of change, both with regards to employment and regards to the GDP growth that has shifted. Focusing on education is a catalyst for amazing things, but it has to be done with a connection to entrepreneurship, with a recognition to the job environment that you're creating. And that connection is something not to be shackled by in many cases, but to be lifted up by, because I think when we think about the urgency of the economic needs and the importance of that relevance to your students, you can actually drive amazing things with motivated learners and leaders that are supporting that change holistically. Now, we have to think about this broadly, and one of the things that I'm proud to be connected to is the For Africa initiative, which does this work by providing leadership and tools and foundational elements across Africa to enable students to succeed, to train hundreds of thousands of students to be prepared for this workforce. We know that literacy is critical. Digital literacy, technology literacy, skills literacy is critical for us to drive this growth. Projects like the Literacy for Life, Matutu Literacy for Life program provides that skill set, that foundation that we need to enable students to have the tools that they need to grow, to pursue education actively, with aggressive thoughts as well as a hunger to achieve more. We know that requires a connection in and out of the classroom to content, a connection to ideas. It also requires a connection to the internet in many cases. And we know and have to address the area of connectivity in this country and countries around the world that struggle. I was just in South Africa, and actually in Limpopo, we're actually working on a project.
If you look around the world today, there are about 3.3
Sorry about that. To actually drive the change that we need with a project called TV White Spaces. And TV White Spaces actually is creating connectivity using the TV broadband space and the spectrum inside broadband to drive the change that we need to connect rural environments to the internet. And that foundational thinking is actually what we need to do. So let's start with a foundation for change. Let's recognize that the time is now. The potential for all of you to learn from lessons from around the world of education is real. I'm excited by it. I know there's often too much negativity about the pace of change in education, but the best time to be a country that has actually had a very sort of a foundation without technology is now. because the technology is getting better. The ideas and lessons are getting more powerful. The ability to use data, to use richer devices and content to drive effectiveness and change is real now more than ever before in our history. And so I leave you with a notion to challenge the expectations of change, to not accept or settle because of the realities of economic conditions, the reality of school environments, or the reality of connectivity, to settle for anything less but true transformation and breakthrough. I know with all of your leadership and work, we can do amazing things, and I'm excited about the opportunity to serve that change and be about the opportunities that you have to make real impact possible every day. So I hope we have some questions to drive a conversation that will hopefully spark some new ideas. So thanks. Maybe we could raise the lights for some questions.
Good morning. I'm Poonam Ramjavan from the Mauritius Research Council, Mauritius. My question is like about teacher training, because I know when we are talking about introducing ICT technology in schools, everybody focuses on technology, but less focus is given on teacher training. So the teachers, one is they don't know how to incorporate ICT into their curriculum.
Yes.
And second is, I think they also resist change because they already have a lot of workload. And the system demands like rote learning, examination, so they don't have time to integrate computers or laptops, and this requires a lot of behavioral change, which you didn't talk about, like how
Yes.
do we bring in this attitude and behavioral change in teachers to adopt technology?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is a huge conversation, an area of focus for me. I may have a bit of a controversial point of view on this, but I actually think that the focus for training that we must shift more attention to, while I know the need for teacher training is huge, and we're certainly focused on that, is training leaders. Your school leaders have a tough, big job, but they need to actually power the transformation. I visited and I've met with teachers in many of your countries who are doing amazing things that are not being shared or celebrated even by their school leaders. I've talked to teachers that have said, this project is something that I keep quiet because I don't want to share it with other teachers because I'm not really supposed to do this type of stuff. And what we need to do is actually have leaders who understand how to create a culture for change. How do they create an agile environment in the school? How do they create the language for sort of hunger for learning for students? So you need to have a training for leaders to understand how to harness this transition. How do they create new innovations? How do they share that innovation across teachers? And that's the foundation I think we need to put first. And putting a leadership framework in for planning, for hiring, for the environment for change in schools is critical. As it relates to teacher training, I think it's absolutely less critical now to train teachers on using computers and technology. That certainly was something that I did. I've been at Microsoft for 25 years, almost, and I've visited for thousands of teachers. Microsoft with Partners in Learning, we've trained about 12 million teachers actively. So I've been in training sessions with teachers. In the early days, it was pretty much how to use a computer. I think that training is becoming less needed, and what teachers need to do is actually be sort of connected to a new way of teaching, a way of teaching that actually connects them to the world of learning around them. One of the things that many of you may have heard me speak before, I often will say to teachers, and this is a reflection of how we are making progress in technology. I'll ask teachers to read a statement that I'll say, your students are learning without you. And I'll ask them to think about what they feel. And if I'll ask teachers, if you feel negative by that, if you feel worried about that, then we've got to work harder to change it. Because the fact that students are learning all around us every day is something that we can empower teachers. So I think the training that we need to do for teachers is to enable them to thrive in that environment that's enabled by technology and not make the technology itself the core of the training. Now, there are amazing tools that are being easier and easier every day that we've got to help teachers to get connected to and use. But I think we have to set that foundation for the right teaching, using technology as a tool, but maybe in some cases not even using technology, recognizing that technology outside of the school is an asset for teachers to leverage to propel their own teaching. And that's the core focus for us. I think that we've got to make that change.
Thank you, thank you. I missed an opportunity of being the first one to ask a question. I'm the Deputy Minister of Telecommunications and Postal Services in South Africa. My name is Hlengwe Mkhize. Really, a simple question is around the cost to access some of these critical tools that our schools require if we're to use technology as a transformation measure. I think we are all in agreement, especially to equalize the education system between urban settings and rural communities. There's no other means except to use technology. But even to just roll out the broadband to these communities, it's really unaffordable. The tools, the equipments, we really think we need to talk about how to make it affordable for developing countries.
Yeah, this is certainly something that I recognize. Affordability for access is a foundation. We have to make not only the devices more not only last longer, but in many cases be more purpose-built for communities that they're landing in, but certainly make sure that they're more affordable. Broadband, but actually thinking about how broadband could be used. And one of the things that technology companies need to do is actually recognize that not only the ability to use offline and online connectivity more sensibly. So when you actually have connectivity that actually doesn't require a constant perpetual connection, but you can actually synchronize information at periods when you have connectivity, that makes all the difference for a school if they have that environment. An always-on connection not only is challenging, but I actually go to schools with the best broadband environments that struggle because you have 50 kids in a classroom all trying to use the same digital tool at the same time that actually clogs the internet pipe that's coming into schools. So using things like online environments where you cache information locally on devices, on hard drives, that synchronize periodically is actually far more effective. So being thoughtful about things like broadband connectivity is critical, and projects like TV white spaces where you're using very low-cost connectivity across rural environments, across a TV spectrum, that's a breakthrough in many cases to enable affordable access to the internet. But I will say that more than all of this is we are spending money on technology and education in all of your countries. The most important thing I will tell you is to spend the money wisely as it relates to the priorities that you do. In most of the cases is having the foundation for change ready. Buying technology when you have leaders who can embrace the change and teachers who are prepared for the change is the first priority. And certainly I start there, starting with leaders and teachers to get them the tools that they need to enable this environment in their classrooms, and then working hard to provide access to all. But I think when we rush to bring technology to solve the problems of today, we actually recognize that the problems of tomorrow will grow because teachers will resist. The technology that we buy today will be under-leveraged, and the money that we've spent, that's a very precious commodity in many countries, will not be used to the most effectiveness. So we've got to work together to not only make things more affordable, but to make the work that we do to leverage the things more impactful. And that's certainly something that I'm deeply committed to because I see the need for change to be more important than ever before in terms of the impact technology can make and the reality that it often makes. And this is the fight that we have to do. Access is the first barrier. In many cases, that's a huge hurdle. But even when you get access, getting impact is going to be a struggle. We see this with countries with lots and lots of riches and lots of waste. I come from the US, a country that's put a lot of money into technology and education, and impact hasn't changed. So I think what we've got to do in countries that have less affordability in terms of technology access is the pressure on us to actually drive that impact is higher. And that's where we have to use partnerships and commitment to make that change possible. But I agree with you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I am going to ask a general question. My name is Jessica Lupo, the Minister of Education, Science, Technology of Uganda here. I welcome all of you. I would like to ask a general question, but first to accept that in this era, we cannot run away from technology in driving transformation, in education, in industry, socio-economic development. That one we cannot run away from. So my question, therefore, is a challenge between, for instance, the level at which some countries have developed their technology vis-a-vis other countries. The level between the way some schools, for instance, because we're talking about education, have developed technologies in transforming education, in improving teaching and learning than others.
Yes.
So the idea is that, to me, technology keeps on increasing very fast and accelerating the level at which those who have access to technology and the advantages to technology, and those who do not have access now and who may have access tomorrow. So
Yes.
it's like there are two different categories. But at the same time, we are saying technology is here with us. So how do we derive a point of convergence? Because tomorrow we are going to have Nsanji Senior Secondary School presenting. We are going to give them some devices so that they can improve the classroom atmosphere. But there is another Nsanji Senior Secondary School here in Uganda,
Yes.
who may not have that opportunity tomorrow. So the idea is, how do we have all this at the same pace, at the same level? I'm sure you pick me. My question is very general. But the big gap between those who have technology now, those who are going to have it tomorrow, how do we have a point of convergence so that we can move together? But I agree with you that the future is Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, Minister, and thank you for hosting. I think it's a thoughtful reality that we have to recognize. Technology has to be a right, not a privilege, for everyone on the planet. We have to get to that point fast and work hard to do that across systems. As someone who's been working in this space for years, the digital divide and the access gap has been a challenge. But I will tell you that the access gap that we're going to face longer term is the access for technology in learning and the impact that it actually has to drive transformation. And this is one of the things that I think would be exciting for you and all the countries who have actually have an access gap, because you can leapfrog by the right foundation, by using technology more thoughtfully, leveraging the learnings of the past for other countries who've wasted, in many cases, decades trying to drive the kind of change that you're aspiring to. But we've got to set our expectations high for change. We need to envision a world where teachers are prepared to embrace technology to actually do things differently in the classroom to enable more. That you inspire students to not only become ready for the workforce, but you actually get them to be creating jobs in companies, building a digital economy by getting kids to be coders and developers and engineers and scientists. That foundation for change in many cases, by starting without technology today, without devices in schools, without computers in the hands of teachers, in many ways you have to recognize the opportunities not just to catch up to the reality of the past. You've got to actually use that opportunity to pivot and leap above many, many other countries, and that's the opportunity. Certainly, there are many, many folks in this room who are worried to actually just solve the core access gap, but let's do it with the recognition that we're going to expect more for achievement, expect more for integration, expect more from technology. Companies like Microsoft, Intel, HP, all of us need to be much more in service to drive the kind of change that's going to be enabling the real impact that you want to make, and not just provide technology to address the access gap. That's not big enough for your ambition and vision. It's a foundation we have to recognize, but I think we can certainly do it by leveraging the opportunities that we've had to leapfrog and really present the opportunity to propel going forward. So I'm excited about that potential across many, many of the countries represented in this room.
Okay, we'll have a couple more questions. I'm just going to hand over to Claire to pass the microphone around. If you don't mind me just commenting, we're going to bring in the other guests from these companies. If you don't mind me commenting, Anthony, okay, I might just be an event organizer, but I set up AfricanBrains for a purpose. It has a fundamental principle behind it. That is, most of the countries here today, as a percentage of GDP, spend more on education than the OECD average. Rwanda is 7.2%. Ethiopia, spends, I think, 23% of its government budget on education. It's just coming from a lower GDP base. So the principle that we set up AfricanBrains was fundamentally the partnership between government and industry, okay? These guys have the technology, they have the laptops, the software, the connectivity, and so on. They also realize the potential of the huge African market. For example, the second biggest mobile phone market in the world now, 1.2 billion mobile phones. And in the recognition of that market share, partnership is the key to answer the question, especially that you put forward, Minister, and also Minister Mkhize, about cost. If you decide, Uganda, 8 million students decide to have one-to-one laptops, for example, that is a huge investment. But you have the purchasing power and the persuasive power to these corporate partners to say, okay, we've got the market. And if one of our school children uses a certain type of technology, a certain type of product, they develop a hinterland of market. They take the laptop home, families, they want to have that product, the brothers and sisters. And so you have the persuasive power, if you've got 7, 8 million students, for example, to say, okay, you want our market, come into our country, invest in our country. What we really need to see is greater investment, in my opinion, in local manufacturing, local distribution of products and services. It doesn't always have to be shipped around the world. It should be that we should all be pushing in this room for the brand made in Africa. So excuse me for my opinion on that, but it's a passion that I have to elucidate to you. I'm going to bring in the rest of the guests, but there's a couple of more questions, Claire. So please, from Jaco de Twat, UNESCO.
Thank you very much for highlighting the important role that teachers can play in the education environment and technology, especially as World Teachers Day come up on the 5th of October. But I think there's another reality that we also need to recognize, and that's the important role of a non-hierarchical learning environment where learners can learn from each other. And I don't know if you could maybe just highlight a few elements that policymakers can do in order to create that peer-to-peer learning environment where we also recognize the important role of innovation of young people and of learners and transmitting that knowledge to others.
Yes, I think that's the critical part I make with this notion, this statement that students are learning without you to educators, that the students are connecting and collaborating in and outside of the classroom in new ways. And in many cases, the opportunity that we have is not to try to compete with that by bringing technology into the classrooms, but to enable teachers to be empowered by that, to embrace that collaboration and connection. We also need to actually start to assess skills. It's actually no longer good enough to just want to drive leadership and creation and creativity and collaboration inside classrooms. We need to actually power teachers with the skills to assess how students are collaborating, make that part of the judgment and evaluation of a student. In many cases, when people think about 21st century skills and competencies, and this is part of the new PISA assessment, they see a risk of losing the connection to core content. In many ways, seeing them as opposition, where if we focus on leadership, students won't learn as much about history if we just don't focus on the core discipline of history, or if we focus on abstract thinking, maybe algebra will be weakened. But the realities we see from research is that when you focus on the connection to skills across all of the disciplines and subjects, there's a hunger and relevance to drive richness and achievement in subjects. So when we focus on computational thinking first before coding, and abstract thinking first before algebra, and creativity and collaboration as a core across subjects, we can drive that environment. But that's absolutely critical, but it's also critical to the workforce. The workforce that you're preparing your students for, these are disciplines that are needed. In the industrial age, things like creativity and collaboration not only weren't needed, they were shunned. But the workforce of today actually requires those skills. So making that thoughtful, but also thoughtful to the assessment model inside of your classrooms is critical.
Thank you very much. My name is Naledi Pando, as has been said. Let me be devil's advocate for a moment. Firstly, I agree with you very much, and other colleagues, that the empowerment of teachers is absolutely imperative. We've had an initiative through which we've tried to empower rural schools with a technology for rural education program. And we found that one of the key interventions had to be a focus on teachers. That if we thought we could introduce technology to children without empowering teachers first, we were making a fundamental mistake. And so it was quite a hard lesson, because we began with a great deal of enthusiasm and then found we were meeting quite a barrier in terms of teachers' attitude and comfort in the class. The kids tended to be ahead of them, and it caused quite a negative setting. But once we shifted, I think the reception of technology in schooling was quite incredible. The key was identifying an education non-governmental organization that has a strength in teacher development to work with teachers in the area. So it was a multiplicity of partnerships that we needed to establish in order to do this. So on that part, I strongly support what is being said. But here's the devil's advocate part.
Yes.
I believe that when you use the concept partnership, you're talking of equal partners, or should be. Now, if we are thinking of African education as being the client of established technology companies, I have a serious problem with that. Because our ambitions in Africa is to produce ourselves. We want to industrialize, we want to manufacture. So what I'm keen on hearing is not that there'll be loads of boxes of laptops to schools in South Africa, but I want to know who is interested in producing laptops in South Africa, number one. Number two, the statistics we've seen over there indicate that one of our most significant problems, and I acknowledge this for South Africa, is youth unemployment. So I'm keen to know which of the partners have a solution to young adults who are unemployed and unskilled. That, for me, will help me address a huge political problem and social problem in my country. So yes, certainly education, technology tools into schools, but important for us, job creation, economic growth, manufacturing, industrialization, and addressing employment. That, for me, is true partnership. So I'd love to hear you on that. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I think we're not we're in opposition, and I tried to defer from speaking on Microsoft, but I certainly will just impart a little bit. I think this is the spirit of all the partners here. Our priority as it relates to focusing on this space is to enable students to grow your economies more broadly. Most of the work that we do is actually not to actually sell as a relationship, as a vendor to schools, but to empower your schools to actually create a broader, thriving economy in your country. And certainly at Microsoft and many of the companies, we provide either deep discounts or free tools and technologies to support that growth, to enable that education environment to thrive and grow economies that will produce laptops and actually manufacture tools and science technologies, et cetera, to create jobs, to grow the opportunity for all of our countries and companies to succeed. The reality for that partnership has got to be connected to what we're trying to do together. And it's not in terms of what we need to do to provide devices, et cetera. In many cases, it's skills. One of the things that we do with a program called USpark is enable students to get skills and job skills to grow the tools to start companies, to actually have development tools, to actually learn how to use things like Microsoft Office to actually get employed across Africa in other companies. This is the stuff that we need to do foundationally for jobs. It's a core focus for us. I think when you think about these technology providers, what we've got to do is recognize all of our missions to enable the change that you're trying to make. And that's where I think all of us are coming from. There may be transactions to get there, but it all has to be rooted there. And I will encourage all of you to expect that from each of us, to hold us to the fire, to that, to make sure that we're aligned together. Why I said, what is a mountaintop? I want us to aspire and dream together, because we can work harder when we have that passion connection to make that change possible. And when we've got thriving African economies with companies and businesses producing new innovation, creating new jobs, that will all help us drive the kind of growth that we need to see as well. So I think that we're all in this together in that respect. So that true partnership is established. So thank you very much. Thanks very much for your time. I look forward to speaking with many of you throughout the week, but thanks very much for your commitment and your patience and your focus throughout the early morning discussions. Thank you.